My name is Efrain Gonzalez, and I am from a town nestled in the highlands of Michoacan, where avocado orchards have become the livelihood of many families. However, we are also the target of greed and violence. I was born in 2000, and by the time I turned 20, my father was already in a state of despair that I could not fully understand. I had grown up surrounded by avocado trees, seeing how their green fruits were both our hope and the source of our problems: extortion, threats, and criminal groups. But none of that prepared me for the realization that the greatest threat came from somewhere else, from a place darker and more sinister than simple human ambition. This is the story of how my Mila lost her land and how madness took my father. I want to tell it so that at least those who hear it understand that sometimes forces simmer in the shadows, and no matter how hard one tries, they cannot be controlled without paying a price. I remember my childhood as a relatively happy time. Although we were not rich, we never lacked food. My parents, Pascual Gonzalez and Lydia, worked in the orchard with dedication. We lived in a modest house on the edge of the land with cement floors and unplastered brick walls. I grew up there among the laughter of my mother and the quiet smile of my father, who always taught me to respect the earth and the cycles of nature. Even so, over the years, something began to disturb my surroundings: the shadows in the avocado grove. When I was 14 or 15 years old, my father became increasingly nervous. Some nights, I noticed he would get up in the middle of the night, take a flashlight, and go into the trees. Sometimes I would accompany him to see what was happening, but he always answered evasively. "It was just a noise, my son. Don't worry, go back to sleep." However, I sensed that he was worried about something beyond simple thieves or wild animals. I did not understand it until much later. By 2020, I was already 20. The region had undergone radical transformations. The demand for avocados had grown disproportionately, bringing both wealth and criminal groups. These groups collected protection fees and controlled the orchards. Some families were violently dispossessed of their land, while others paid fees to be allowed to continue working. My father tried to protect our land, but the threats increased. While I was learning more efficient farming techniques, my father was searching for desperate solutions. One afternoon, as I was returning from town with provisions, I came across two armed men near our door. They were speaking to my father in an authoritative tone. One of them looked at me coldly and made it clear that if we wanted to continue producing, we had to pay the price. When they left, I asked my father how we were going to handle it. He only said, "Don't get involved, Efrain. I will know what to do. I already spoke to someone who is going to help me." His words struck me as strange, as if he had found a different path, one beyond logic. A few days later, my mother confessed to me with concern that my father had been visiting Rosa, a tree witch from the neighboring town. I had always known that people turned to her for cleansings, cures, and remedies. But my father? He had never believed in such things. However, the desperation caused by extortion could drive anyone down an unexpected path. I wanted to accompany him to understand what was happening, but he firmly forbade me. "It's not your business, son. Leave me alone." Curiosity got the better of me. One night, I secretly followed him. I saw him enter a humble cabin in a remote part of the Sierra, surrounded by lit candles. Stealthily, I approached a small window. Inside, I saw my father sitting in front of a woman of about 60 years old. Her face was weathered, her hands wrinkled, and she held a bowl filled with herbs. She spoke in a low voice, but I managed to catch a few phrases. My father told Doña Rosa that he was suffocating. If he didn't pay, he would lose the orchard and everything he had planted. If that happened, we would be ruined. Doña Rosa told him there was a way, but it wasn't free. She demanded a high price. She asked if he was willing to make a pact. My heart skipped a beat. I watched as my father lowered his head in doubt before finally nodding. She stood up, rummaged through a trunk, and handed him a small red figure, a devil carved in clay. I couldn't see it clearly, but an unpleasant smell reached me. Something told me the figure had been impregnated with blood or some other substance. My father carefully put it away and shook her hand in farewell. That was all I saw before sneaking away. When my father returned home, his demeanor changed. He avoided my gaze. In the following days, he threw himself furiously into working in the avocado field, as if chasing an unattainable goal. Suddenly, the trees appeared lusher, bearing large, shiny fruits. This was unusual for the season. It was as if the earth had revived overnight. At first, I felt happy. I thought we had finally found a way out of the crisis. However, my nights became plagued with nightmares. I dreamed of a red devil prowling among the trees. One morning, while we were working the land, my hoe struck something solid underground. I dug carefully and, to my horror, unearthed a red devil figurine about 20 centimeters tall, carved in clay with twisted horns. It was covered in soil mixed with needles and blood. The stench churned my stomach. As I held it, I felt as if something was clinging to my hand, an unpleasant heat spreading through my fingers. My father came running when he saw my dismayed expression. The moment he noticed what I was holding, he turned pale. "What is this?" I asked, my voice trembling. "Let it go, Ephraim. Don't touch it anymore." He snatched the figurine from me and pressed it against his chest. "You shouldn't have been digging here. I told you not to come to this area." An unknown fury rose within me. So many secrets, so much clandestinity. I demanded answers. Taking a deep, trembling breath, my father finally confessed. "It is part of a pact to protect the orchard," he admitted. "Rosa told me that if I wanted our lands to prosper without falling into criminal hands, I had to bury several offerings, these figurines, sprinkled with certain fluids, animal blood, excrement, and I had to recite prayers. In return, the spirit would grant us abundant fruit and drive away thieves. In time, those who extorted us would flee." But, he added, "In exchange, you must fulfill the pact. You have to feed it, and you must never break the promise." My heart pounded. I begged my father to stop, to turn away from such dark practices. But he lowered his gaze and carefully placed the figurine into a plastic bag. "Ephraim, there is no turning back. I must finish what I started. The witch warned me. If I do not fulfill this, it will cost us dearly." That same afternoon, my father disappeared for several hours. Gathering my courage, I went looking for him. I remembered the witch's cabin. When I arrived, I found him speaking to her, shouting. Hiding behind a bush, I overheard their conversation. "I told you, you must fulfill the sacrifices." Rosa's sharp voice cut through the air. "Burying the figurines is not enough. You must feed the earth with new blood. If you do not, the red devil will claim you." "I cannot, Doña Rosa," my father protested. "I cannot kill anyone. I cannot make a sacrifice. It's already hard enough for me to do this filthy ritual." Rosa laughed dryly. "Then be ready to face the consequences." 2 weeks passed. The orchard flourished like never before. The avocados multiplied, the leaves shone, and the extortion stopped. But at what cost? I had even heard rumors that some criminals had been arrested at a military checkpoint. My father smiled discreetly, as if the protection was working. However, his face remained gloomy. He stopped sleeping well, murmured words at midnight, and sometimes at mealtime, he would stare at a fixed point without touching his plate. I didn't know whether to be happy for the bonanza or fear the bill that would come. My mother, on the other hand, felt relieved. Lucia said that perhaps God had heard our prayers. I wanted to tell her the truth, but I was held back by the terror of breaking the fragile peace that existed. I was also beginning to realize that the land was cursed. At night, in the avocado grove, dancing shadows could be seen among the trees, and some farmhands complained of strange noises. 2 months later, this apparent blessing began to reverse itself. Almost overnight, the fruit rotted on the branches. A large portion of the harvest was spoiled, and my parents had to throw away tons of soft, stinking avocados. One of the farmhands discovered giant anthills devouring the roots, while others claimed to have seen larvae sprouting from the earth like a swarm. My father panicked. I saw him running, tearing out his hair, desperately trying to rip away the dead branches. In a fit of rage, he confessed to me, crying that this was the response to his refusal to comply with the demands. "I didn't want to sacrifice anything alive. I only offered the blood of dead chickens," he said. "But that wasn't enough for the CR." When one of our farmhands fell ill inexplicably, fainting in the middle of the field and foaming at the mouth, my mother became alarmed and called a country doctor. He couldn't explain the illness. "It looks like poisoning," he said. The farmhand was delirious, murmuring that he had seen shadows. Meanwhile, his skin turned pale. A chill ran through me. It felt as if something evil was spreading through the earth, and we couldn't stop it. One cloudy afternoon, I decided to confront my father once and for all. I found him in an old warehouse, drinking mezcal with a lost look in his eyes. Furious, I snatched the bottle from his hands and demanded an explanation. Enough, Dad. Look at us. The harvest is rotting. People are getting sick. Is it worth continuing with all this? Go dig up those figurines. Do a cleansing. Ask God for forgiveness. But stop this madness. He just looked at me with red, tear-filled eyes. Son, the witch told me there is no return without fulfilling the deal, he muttered. I tried to offer chickens, but the devil wants something bigger, the blood of a large animal, or human blood. That's absurd, Dad, I replied, nauseated. We're not going to kill anyone for a ritual. Then we're going to lose everything, he whispered in a broken voice. The garden, the house, or maybe something worse. I despaired, begging him to repent, to ask a priest for help, anything. But he just shook his head. The witch warned me, if I back down, the shadow will come for me and my lineage. But I am not a murderer, Ephraim. I cannot stain my hands. With those words, I understood his dilemma. He was trapped in a pact he could neither consummate nor break. In an attempt to save him, I went to the town parish and spoke with Father Don Julian, an old and kind man. I didn't tell him the whole story. I was afraid he'd think I was crazy. But I confessed that my father had been involved in rituals to make the garden prosper, and now something evil was happening. The priest looked at me with pity. Son, the church does not approve of these practices. I can pray and bless your house, but these ties with the devil demand sincere repentance from your father. I accepted his blessing and took him to the orchard one day, but my father hid. He refused to participate in the prayers. Don Julian sprinkled holy water all over the place, but nothing changed. The next morning, at dawn, the trees were covered in a dense, dark fog. Their leaves withered even more. It was as if the blessing had irritated the cursed presence. The following weeks were in agony. My father stopped eating, locked himself in his room, and fell into a growing silence. At night, he would get up sleepwalking, wandering around the house, murmuring incomprehensible prayers. My desperate mother begged him to talk, to let us help him, but he simply ignored her. There was an abysmal emptiness in his gaze, as if his soul had been devoured by guilt. The orchard became a ghostly landscape, dry rotten fruit and an unbearable stench. The few remaining profits vanished. To top it off, bank papers arrived. My father had mortgaged part of the land to settle past extortions, and without production, we were about to lose everything. That was the last straw. My mother cried in secret, and I tried to raise money by selling what little we had. Meanwhile, my father wasted away in the shadows. Before the inevitable ruin, I decided to confront the witch on my own. I went to her cabin without telling anyone. She greeted me with an annoyed gesture, as if my presence was an interruption. "Now you come to ask me for help, boy," she said with irony. I explained what was happening: the destruction of the orchard, my father's madness, the mortgage, and the looming loss of everything. The witch raised an eyebrow. "If your father had completed the ritual, none of this would be happening," she replied. "There's still a way to reverse it, but it will cost you." "How?" I asked suspiciously. "The red devil demands a sacrifice, a warm-blooded animal or a human being. If you do it before the full moon, the curse may be lifted and fertility will return to your land." "It can't be. You want us to kill someone? It's not what I want. That's just how things work. You choose, your clean hands or the salvation of your orchard." I left there with a heavy heart, not knowing which path to take. If the witch was telling the truth, there was only one dark way out. Desperate, I decided to try something. A friend, Matteo, lent me an old bull. That night, trembling, I attempted to replicate a fragment of the ritual I had heard my father recite. I spilled some of the animal's blood onto the earth. I felt like a murderer. The bull fell, pitifully wounding my spirit. I didn't kill it. I only made a cut on its leg to extract the blood. I buried one of my father's red devil figurines and sprinkled it with blood. Then, sobbing, I covered the hole and returned the bull to the corral, bandaging its wound. But the next morning, nothing had changed. The trees were still withered. When my father found out, he flew into a rage. "You don't even know the complete right. Surely you did it wrong, and now this will only get worse," he shouted with a demented fury. I had never seen him like that. He slammed his fists on the table, and for a moment I thought he was going to hit me. My mother intervened, crying, begging us not to fight. From that moment on, my father's decline accelerated. He stopped talking to me completely, spending his hours sitting in an armchair, staring at the ruined land. And so, our fate was sealed.